The crisp autumn air danced through my hair as I walked across the university campus, the sound of students chatting and laughing filling the air. I'd always loved this time of year, the way the leaves painted the world in hues of orange and gold, the cool breeze that carried promises of new beginnings. But this particular morning my mind was far from my usual calm. My nephew James was starting his first day at medical school, the same university where I taught psychology. The thought had been lingering in my mind ever since he announced his acceptance a few months ago. I couldn't help but smile at the memory of him standing in my living room, grinning ear to ear, holding up his acceptance letter like it was a trophy. We hadn't seen each other much over the past year, not since his birthday party when he had just turned 18. Back then he was still a boy in my eyes, but time had a funny way of sneaking up on people. I wondered how much he had changed. He was 19 now, a man in his own right, and I couldn't deny that a part of me was curious, maybe too curious, to see how he had grown. I made my way to the faculty building, my heels clicking softly against the pavement. My students loved me for my relaxed teaching style, my humor, and perhaps the way I carried myself. I had worked hard to maintain a polished appearance, always wearing clothes that complemented my figure without being too flashy. I knew how to command attention without demanding it, and it had become something of a trademark among the students. Today was no exception. I wore a fitted cream blouse tucked into a high-waisted skirt, with my hair falling effortlessly over my shoulders. As I entered the building, a few students greeted me warmly and I returned their smiles. But beneath my composed exterior, my thoughts kept circling back to James. When I finally arrived at my office, I set down my bag and checked my schedule. My first lecture wasn't for another hour, which gave me some time to settle in. I had just opened my laptop when there was a soft knock at the door. "Come in," I called, expecting one of my students seeking advice. Instead, the door opened to reveal James. I blinked, momentarily taken aback. He stood there, tall and confident, his dark hair slightly tousled as if he had just run a hand through it. He was dressed casually, jeans and a fitted black shirt that showed off his lean frame. His eyes met mine and for a second I forgot how to breathe. "Hi, Aunt Claire," he said, his voice deeper than I remembered. "I thought I'd stop by and say hello before things get busy." I quickly recovered, standing up from my desk and walking over to him. "James, you look—" I hesitated, searching for the right word. "You look grown up." He chuckled, a sound that was both familiar and different at the same time. "I guess a lot can change in a year." We embraced briefly and I couldn't help but notice how firm his shoulders felt beneath my hands. When we pulled away, he gave me that same mischievous grin he used to flash when he was a boy, but now it carried an edge of maturity. "How's it feel to be back at school?" I asked, gesturing for him to sit. "Nerve-wracking but exciting," he admitted, settling into the chair across from me. "It's weird seeing you here though. I keep expecting you to tell me to do my homework." I laughed softly. "Well, I am technically your professor now, just not for any of your classes." "Lucky me," he said, his tone light but his gaze lingering on me a moment longer than necessary. I shifted slightly in my seat, unsure of how to interpret it. Was it just nostalgia or was there something else in the way he looked at me? We chatted for a while, catching up on everything we'd missed over the past year. He told me about his summer job, his plans for med school, and how excited he was to be on campus. But as the conversation flowed, I couldn't ignore the subtle tension that seemed to weave its way between us. It wasn't uncomfortable, just unexpected. At one point he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and I noticed the way his gaze dipped briefly to my neckline before meeting my eyes again. My heart skipped a beat, but I quickly brushed it off. I was imagining things. I had to be. "I should probably let you get back to work," he said eventually, standing up. "I just wanted to see you before the chaos starts." I stood as well, walking him to the door. "I'm glad you did," I said sincerely. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." "Thanks, Aunt Claire," he said, but there was a softness in his voice that made the title feel different, less familial and more personal. He hesitated for a moment as if he wanted to say something else, but then he smiled and left. I closed the door behind him, leaning against it as I exhaled deeply. My heart was still racing and I couldn't quite understand why. It was just James. My nephew, the boy I used to take to the park, the teenager who once told me all about his dreams of becoming a doctor. But he wasn't a boy anymore. And that realization was more unsettling than I cared to admit. The lecture hall was buzzing with the low hum of students murmuring, flipping through notebooks and adjusting their seats as they prepared for class. I stood at the front of the room, taking a moment to center myself. No matter how many lectures I'd given, that initial surge of nerves always found me, but I knew how to hide it well. The crisp click of my heels against the polished floor and the faint scent of the coffee I'd sipped earlier anchored me in the moment. "Good afternoon, everyone," I said, my voice warm but firm. The room gradually quieted, all eyes turning toward me. Today we'll be diving into the concept of cognitive dissonance and its impact on decision-making. Now, I know it sounds complicated, but trust me, by the end of this lecture you'll start noticing it in everyday life. As I began the lecture, my gaze briefly scanned the room, passing over familiar and unfamiliar faces alike. But when my eyes met James's, something shifted inside me, like a jolt I wasn't ready for. He was sitting toward the middle of the lecture hall, not too close to draw attention but not too far to seem distant. His dark hair fell slightly over his forehead, and he had one hand resting casually on his notebook while the other toyed absent-mindedly with his pen. But it wasn't his posture that caught me, it was the way he was looking at me. His gaze wasn't the passive kind of attention most students gave me. It was focused, unwavering, and curious, as if he were studying me as much as the material. I felt heat rise to my cheeks and quickly turned my attention back to the slides on the screen behind me. "Keep it together, Claire," I scolded myself silently. This was James, my nephew, a first-year student, and I was a professional. This wasn't the time to get distracted by something as innocent as eye contact. But it wasn't innocent, was it? Not the way it made my heart flutter. I moved through the lecture, explaining examples of cognitive dissonance in advertising, relationships, and career choices. My voice carried confidently, and I smiled when I saw several students nodding along, clearly connecting the dots. This was my comfort zone, standing in front of a room, breaking down complex ideas and making them accessible. My nerves faded, replaced by the familiar thrill of teaching. But then James raised his hand. "Professor Bennett," he said, his voice clear and confident. His tone had that perfect blend of respect and familiarity, a reminder of the blurred lines we were towing. "Yes, James?" I asked, hoping my voice didn't betray the nerves fluttering inside me. "In your example about career choices, you mentioned how people might stick with an unsatisfying job to avoid the discomfort of admitting they made a mistake. Wouldn't that apply to relationships too? Like staying in one even if it's not working just to avoid feeling like you failed?" The question wasn't just smart. It was insightful, the kind of observation that usually came from older, more experienced students. His gaze stayed locked on mine as he spoke, and for a brief moment the room seemed to shrink, leaving just the two of us. My breath caught and I felt something stir deep within me. Pride, admiration, and something else I wasn't ready to name. I cleared my throat, forcing myself to focus. "That's an excellent observation," I said, giving him a small smile. "Yes, it absolutely applies to relationships. In fact, studies show that people often stay in situations long past their expiration date because they're more focused on the time and energy they've already invested rather than what's actually good for them." I could see the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes as he nodded, his lips curling into a small smile that sent a wave of warmth through me. "Stop it, Claire. You're reading too much into this." But I couldn't deny the way he held himself, the quiet confidence that had replaced the awkward teenage boy I remembered. He didn't slouch or fidget like the other students. He listened, thought deeply, and spoke as if he belonged in the room. As I continued the lecture, I found myself sneaking glances at him, unable to help it. He wasn't just smart, he was captivating. And that realization sent a spark of nervous energy through me. When the lecture ended, I closed my laptop and dismissed the class, watching as students gathered their things and trickled out of the hall. James remained seated, his gaze still on me as if he were waiting for something. I busied myself with organizing my notes, hoping he would leave before I had to confront the growing tension that pulsed between us. But when I looked up, he was standing by my desk, his bag slung casually over his shoulder. "You really made that topic come alive," he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear. I wasn't expecting to enjoy it as much as I did. I chuckled, trying to play it off as casual. Well, I'm glad to hear it. Cognitive dissonance isn't exactly the most thrilling subject. He tilted his head slightly, studying me with that same intensity one had felt during the lecture. I think it has more to do with the way you teach it. There it was again, that subtle undercurrent in his words that left me breathless, even though I knew I shouldn't be. I could feel my professionalism slipping, like a loose thread threatening to unravel the entire fabric of who I was supposed to be in this moment. Well, if you ever have questions, you know where to find me, I said, my voice a touch too formal as I tried to create distance between us. I do, he replied, a flicker of something playful crossing his face. He lingered for a second longer before finally turning to leave, and I exhaled the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The room felt quieter after he left, as if he had taken all the air with him. I sat down at my desk, pressing my fingertips to my temples as I tried to steady myself. What was I doing? This wasn't normal. I had always been good at maintaining boundaries, at keeping my professional life separate from anything personal. But James wasn't just any student. And no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, I couldn't ignore the truth. Something inside me had been awakened today. And it wasn't going away. The day had been long, but I had barely noticed the hours slipping by. After my last lecture, I returned to my office to gather my things, feeling a strange buzz of energy beneath my skin. My thoughts had been clouded since the lecture, circling around James and the way his gaze lingered just a little too long, the way his words seemed to carry something deeper, something unspoken. I took a deep breath, trying to shake the thoughts away. He's your nephew, Claire. Don't read into it. But it was easier said than done. My heart fluttered at the memory of his question about relationships, the insight in his voice, and the way he looked at me like I wasn't just his aunt or his professor, but something else entirely. I packed my bag and slipped into my coat, preparing to leave when there was a soft knock on the door. I didn't need to guess who it was. James, I said, surprised but not entirely. He leaned against the doorframe, his hands in the pockets of his coat, looking as effortlessly composed as ever. I thought I'd wait for you, he said casually. Walk you out, maybe? I hesitated for a second, my mind scrambling for an excuse to say no, but nothing came. And the truth was, I didn't want to say no. That's sweet of you, I finally said, grabbing my bag. Let's go. We walked through the quiet corridors of the university, our footsteps echoing softly against the tiled floor. Outside, the evening air was crisp, the scent of autumn leaves mingling with the faint aroma of nearby street vendors selling roasted chestnuts. The sky was painted in soft shades of twilight, the sun dipping just below the horizon. As we strolled, James seemed different, more relaxed, more confident than I'd ever seen him. He guided the conversation effortlessly, asking about my day, my classes, even sharing funny anecdotes about his first day of med school. It felt natural, easy, but there was something else beneath the surface. Something simmering. At one point, he reached out and gently touched my arm to guide me across the street. The warmth of his hand lingered even after he let go, and I found myself hyper-aware of every step we took together. I know a place, he said suddenly, his eyes glinting with excitement. Come with me. I followed without question, and before I knew it, we were standing in front of a cozy little cafe tucked away on a side street, its windows glowing warmly against the darkening sky. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and sweet pastries greeted us as we stepped inside. James held the door open for me, and I couldn't help but notice the way he moved, so sure of himself, so effortlessly charming. We found a small table by the window, and as we sat down, he ordered for both of us. A rich cappuccino for me and a chai latte for himself, along with a slice of decadent chocolate cake to share. I remember you loved cappuccinos, he said with a grin, and my chest tightened at the thought that he remembered something so small. The cafe was quiet, with soft jazz playing in the background, and for a moment, it felt like we were in our own little world. He complimented me on my lecture, on how I had a way of making difficult concepts feel accessible. His words were genuine, thoughtful, and they touched me in ways I wasn't prepared for. I hadn't felt this seen or appreciated in a long time. You make things seem so easy, he said, his gaze soft but intense. But I know it can't be. I swallowed, feeling the vulnerability creeping in. It's not always easy, I admitted. But I love what I do. And your life outside work? He asked, leaning in slightly. Is it what you want? The question made my throat tighten. I hesitated, stirring my cappuccino aimlessly. I don't know, I said finally. It's complicated. We talked a little more, but the question lingered in my mind as we left the cafe and resumed our walk. The streets were quieter now and the cool air nipped at my cheeks. James walked close to me, his presence steady and comforting. Then my phone buzzed in my bag, the sudden noise breaking the moment. I pulled it out and saw my husband's name flashing on the screen. I hesitated before answering. Hi, I said, keeping my voice steady. Where are you? He asked. I thought you'd be home by now. My pulse quickened and without thinking I lied. I'm still at the university. I had a lot of papers to check. There was a pause on the other end. Hey, just don't be too late. I won't, I promised, and as I hung up, I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. But it wasn't just guilt, it was something deeper. I could have told him the truth that I was walking with my nephew, but I didn't. Because deep down I knew this wasn't just an innocent walk. There was something more between us, something that felt too delicate, too dangerous to expose. James must have sensed my unease because he looked at me, his brow furrowed. Everything okay? I nodded, forcing a smile. Yeah. Just my husband wondering where I am. He fell silent for a moment before asking, Are you happy with him? I stopped walking, the question hitting me like a gust of wind. I thought about the years I had spent with my husband, the way our relationship had become a routine more than a partnership. We're not doing well, I admitted quietly. I don't think I ever really loved him. James's expression softened and he took a step closer. You deserve to be happy, he said gently. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made my chest ache. We continued walking in silence until, suddenly, my heel caught on an uneven patch of pavement and I twisted my ankle. Pain shot through me and I stumbled, grabbing onto James's arm for support. Are you okay? He asked, his voice filled with concern. I think I twisted my ankle, I winced, unable to put weight on it. Without hesitation, James slipped his arm around my waist, supporting me as I tried to hobble forward. No way, he said firmly. We're calling a taxi. Minutes later we were in the back of a cab, his arms still wrapped protectively around me. The warmth of his touch was both comforting and electric, and I found myself leaning into him more than I should have. When we arrived at my house, James helped me to the door, his grip steady as I balanced on one foot. My husband opened the door, his eyes widening as he saw us. What happened? He asked, stepping aside to let us in. I twisted my foot on the way home, I explained, keeping my voice light. James was nearby and helped me get home. My husband thanked him, but as James turned to leave, his eyes met mine one last time. There was something in that gaze. An understanding, a promise, and a spark of something I couldn't deny. As the door closed behind him, I sank onto the couch, my ankle throbbing and my heart racing. I should have felt relieved to be home, safe from the confusing emotions swirling inside me. But I didn't. I felt like something between James and me had just begun, and that terrified me more than anything. That night I lay in bed, the dim glow of the bedside lamp casting soft shadows across the room. My husband was already asleep, his breathing slow and steady, the way it always was when he drifted off quickly after a long day. But I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, replaying every moment of the evening. Every glance, every word, every lingering touch between James and me. I stared at the ceiling, the ache in my ankle pulsing faintly as my heart beat faster. I thought of the way his arm had felt around my waist, steadying me when I couldn't stand on my own. The way he had supported me without hesitation as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And his voice, gentle, reassuring, but with something else beneath it. Something I couldn't stop thinking about. I shifted under the covers, trying to push the thoughts away, but it was impossible. James. His name echoed in my mind, not as my nephew, but as the man who had seen me tonight in a way no one else had in years. Not even my husband. There had been no judgment in his gaze. No sense of obligation. Just care. Genuine, simple, and sincere. And that care had stirred something in me that I hadn't felt in a long time, something I hadn't even known I was craving. Just as I closed my eyes, hoping sleep would finally claim me, my phone vibrated on the nightstand. I grabbed it, the soft glow of the screen illuminating the darkness around me. My breath hitched when I saw the message. James, I hope you're okay. Put on some pants tomorrow. I'm coming to your office before your first class to make you a bandage. I stared at the words, my heart racing. The message was casual, but the warmth behind it was undeniable. He wasn't just checking on me out of politeness. He was making sure I knew he was there for me. The care woven into those simple words made my throat tighten. I typed a quick response, my fingers trembling slightly. Thank you, James. Okay. You don't have to do that. But even as I hit send, I knew he wasn't the type to be easily deterred. And a part of me didn't want him to be. The next morning I woke early, the memory of James's message the first thing on my mind. My ankle throbbed when I swung my legs out of bed and I winced as I tested my weight on it. I would have to be careful today, but that thought was overshadowed by the anticipation of seeing James again. I dressed carefully, choosing a pair of tailored pants and a soft blouse. My heart skipped a beat when I thought of what might happen when he showed up at my office. Would it be awkward? Would the air between us still feel as charged as it had last night? By the time I arrived at my office, the anticipation had grown into a nervous flutter in my chest. I set down my bag and opened my laptop, trying to distract myself by reviewing my notes for the morning lecture. But it was no use. Every sound in the hallway made me glance toward the door, wondering if it was him. Then a soft knock. I swallowed hard, smoothing my blouse before calling out, "Come in." The door opened and there he was, standing in the doorway with a small first aid kit in hand. His hair was slightly messy, as if he hadn't bothered to tame it after stepping out into the cool morning air, and the easy confidence he carried yesterday was still there, but softer, more intimate. "You didn't think I'd forget, did you?" he said, closing the door behind him. I smiled, trying to mask the nervous excitement bubbling inside me. "I figured you'd be too busy with your own classes. I make time for the important things," he replied, and the weight of those words hung in the air between us for a moment before he gestured toward the chair. "Sit. Let's take a look." I obeyed, feeling a little ridiculous as I sat down and rolled up the leg of my pants to reveal my swollen ankle. James knelt in front of me, opening the first aid kit and pulling out a bandage. His hands worked with precision, gently wrapping the soft material around my foot, securing it with care. I watched him, unable to tear my gaze away. His brows were slightly furrowed in concentration, and I noticed the way his fingers brushed against my skin, deliberate, but gentle enough to make my breath hitch. When he looked up, our eyes met, and the air between us grew thick with something I couldn't ignore. "All done," he said softly, but neither of us moved. I felt the heat of his presence, the warmth of his hand still resting lightly on my ankle, and for a moment, the world outside this office didn't exist. It was just us, caught in this strange, delicate space that felt both dangerous and inevitable. Then, as if something inside him broke free, he leaned forward and brushed his lips against mine. The kiss was quick, barely more than a whisper of contact, but it set my entire body on fire. My heart raced, my breath faltering as I leaned into the warmth of him, savoring the way his lips felt against mine. But before I could fully process what was happening, a sharp knock on the door made us both pull away abruptly. I gasped softly, pressing a hand to my lips as if to keep the memory of the kiss locked inside me. James stood, running a hand through his hair as he exhaled, clearly flustered. "Come in," I called, trying to steady my voice as the door opened. It was a student, clutching a notebook and looking nervous. "Professor Bennett, do you have a moment to review something before class?" "Of course," I said, offering a polite smile while silently begging my heart to calm down. "Give me a minute." The student nodded and stepped back into the hallway, leaving the door slightly ajar. James looked at me, his gaze filled with something I couldn't quite name, longing, perhaps, or regret. "I should go," he said quietly, his voice tinged with reluctance. I nodded, still catching my breath. "Thank you for this," I whispered, touching my bandaged ankle. He gave me a soft smile, lingering for a moment longer before turning and slipping out the door. As it closed behind him, I leaned back in my chair, my mind spinning. I had crossed a line. No, we had crossed a line, and there was no pretending otherwise. But the worst part, the part that sent shivers down my spine, was that I didn't regret it. Not the kiss. Not the care he had shown me. Not the way my heart had raced in a way it never had with my husband. The only question now was how far this would go before it became too much.